I think the way we're going to start this is Stephen and I will talk a little bit about some of the tax sale revisions that we're trying to put through, and some of the ideas we have to solve some of the problems, the most important being the due process issue with tax sales not being, or being invalidated because of lack of notice. One of the approaches that I've recommended, and there's no decision, is to try to eliminate the entire question of whether there was due process notice or not, and try to solve the problem through acquisitive prescription. As many of you know, if you hold a property under color of title for 10 years in good faith, which means at the time you took possession you had no reason to believe your title wasn't good, after 10 years you get title to that property. Normally if you just squat on a property you have to wait 30 years. My suggestion is to lower that period to 5 years for a tax sale property, and I would start the 5-year period from the date the tax sale deed is recorded, you know, your 3-year redemption period, and then you would have to possess for at least 2 years. And this, a lot of the problems with the tax sales where there's lack of notice is dealing with vacant and abandoned properties. So if you actually take possession, that's one way to solve the problem. We're also trying to figure out ways to allow notice to be cured after the fact. The 2009 tax sale revisions were intended to address that problem by saying, look, if you didn't get due process notice before the tax sale, that can be cured. There's a lot of the attorneys on the committee and other attorneys who think that that should work, but so far the courts have been going with the absolute nullity thing. You want further comments?
Well, it's important to note something I said before is that there actually has not been a decision in the appellate level yet, which is where all our recorded decisions appear, interpreting the 2009 revision. There are some cases that are pending that interpretation, and I suspect that we'll know more this calendar year about how the revised language in the 2009 legislation affecting what happens with notice or what happens without notice pre-tax sale, how that's interpreted constitutionally. The legislature does not enact constitutional provisions. That's a statute, and it has to be constitutional ultimately, and the courts will decide that. But the fundamental principle of the revision is important to know is notice can happen anytime prior to terminating someone's rights. We kind of talked about this a little bit earlier today about in the adjudicated world, where we haven't terminated their rights yet because we haven't taken their property yet, and they have an absolute right of redemption. So what have they lost? In the way the tax sale code was rewritten is that the tax sale purchaser takes tax sale title to the property at the tax sale, subject to all those interests that are not duly notified. So, in other words, if you want to take tax sale title and terminate everyone's interest in that property and have it clean, then everybody should have been notified. And so what if that doesn't happen before the tax sale? It's left broad. It's left open so that it can happen anytime. So, in other words, theoretically, what the Law Institute came up with was, let's assume you have, this is an easier example, you have a property with one owner and one mortgage company. Both of them have a recorded interest in the property at the time of the tax sale. The taxes go unpaid and goes to tax sale. The tax collector or their due process notification service sends out notice that's sufficient to the owner and fails to notify or properly exert enough efforts to notify the mortgage company. That's the whole case of Mennonite. Normally under the old law, says what happens at the tax sale is property is sold. Now you have it subject to the redemption period, but the event that occurs at the tax sale, the old law, is a title to the property. So the property is sold. That goes right to the due process clause, the 14th Amendment. What can you not do without due process law? Take someone's property, right? So you just did it. The mortgage company has a recorded interest. They didn't get notified, and you just took their property, and you can never go back and change that. Absolute nullity. So what the tax sale revision was by the Law Institute was say, okay, we recognize that sheriffs and governments are not always going to do what they're supposed to do under the Constitution. They're not going to always do a great job of noticing. So what happens when the inevitable happens? That tax sale purchase, in the example I gave you, owner was notified, mortgage company was not notified. Under the revision, arguably, this is what the intent was, that tax sale purchaser would still have good title to the property because the owner was notified, failed to redeem, et cetera, after 3 years. Mortgage company was never notified. So he takes title to the property subject to the mortgage. Instead of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, just give him the property subject to the person's rights who weren't properly notified. Instead of annulling the whole thing, he's got the property with the mortgage on it now. Now, that may not be something he wants, but if you apply that as a principle across the board, evenly to all properties, it makes perfect sense. You are preventing the person who did not get notified from having their rights terminated and allowing the person who did get notified to have their rights terminated. And that was the import of the statute.
The problem with that, of course, is, and I'm playing devil's advocate here, not necessarily agreeing with what I want.
That was the intent. The intent of the statute.
The intent. One of the problems is they did not amend the Louisiana constitutional provisions dealing with tax sales at the time. One of the arguments I have, and I do think there's a very good argument that the due process requirements can be satisfied under the new revised statutes. One of the arguments I've made is that since the Constitution requires that everyone get a 3-year redemption period, if someone doesn't get noticed until 2.5 years, they got their due process notice, but they've been deprived of the 3-year redemption period that was granted by the Constitution. Now, the other side of that is, well, you should have known you hadn't paid your taxes for now 4 or 5 years by the time you get to that period in time. So, but we're just going to have to see what the courts say. To be honest, I'm not optimistic about the due process being held to be satisfied under the new laws. There was I forget which Supreme Court case it was that said that, notice to one co-owner does not satisfy due process if there's 3 other co-owners who didn't get notice, even as to that one who clearly got notice. So I just don't see how we get the Supreme Court to change its mind on that. One of the other things we're working on is to get rid of what everyone seems to dislike, which is the percentage bidding on tax sales. One of the ideas that has been proposed is to replace that with a premium. So if the purchase price is $1,000 and the price is set, it has to be the taxes, the interest, and the tax sale costs is all you can sell the property for, which is why there's no competitive bidding on the price. So what they're saying is that you would bid, $100 or $200 or $500 more in order to get the property. There's several options on what would happen to that money. Some suggest it should be held, and depending on whether the property is redeemed or not, it would go to the tax collector. One of the thoughts I had was to, instead of making it a redemption premium, make it a redemption credit, which would mean if I bid a credit of $500 in 2 years, if they redeem the property, and the redemption price was $2,000, they'd only have to pay $1,500 because I'd given them that $500 back. Another option, which we haven't seriously discussed, would be to adopt something like they were talking about earlier, I think Illinois and New Jersey, where you would take the 18% and bid it down. Here we have a 5% premium or penalty plus 12% interest. So you could start and say at 17% for the first year, and you would bid that down to 16, 12, 10%, whatever for the first year, and then the second year you'd be back up to that 1% per year. So that's one of the things we're working on. There was some discussion, and Brian Danos had briefly talked about it, and what do you do if you've got a 1% tax sale? And what I've come up with, and I've got a case now that will hopefully test whether it works, is what I call the 1% solution. If you buy a tax sale at 1% and you pay the later year's taxes, let's say you pay $10,000. If the tax sale is valid, after your 3 years, you acquired your title, and instead of filing a partition suit and say, you've now got if the property's worth $100,000, your 1% is worth $1,000, that doesn't make any sense. Instead, what you do is you sue him for the $9,900 of taxes you paid, because as your 99% co-owner, he's responsible for that amount. You get your judgment, you take it to the sheriff, you have him seize and sell the property. He sells, a 99% interest. Now, I don't know how many people at a sheriff's sale are going to want to buy a property that they're only buying a 99% interest.
There's only one person, actually.
Probably you.
The 1% person.
It's possible. Some sophisticated people like Stephen and I who know we might be able to game the system a little, but generally you're probably going to get it. You're also going to get it for the lowest price. If you wait till the second time through, if there's no bidders the first time, you might be able to get it at a lower minimum bid and things like that. So that is a way to do it. I've got a case right now where we've got a $5,000 judgment, It's not exactly a tax sale case, but it's a co-owner situation, so it's analogous. And we're waiting to get service of the judgment, and then we're going to go and have the sheriff seize it and sell it and just see what happens. They can always come and pay the $5,000 judgment to avoid the seizure and sale. Whether that will happen in this case, I don't know. They want over $100,000 for a property that's not worth $100,000 even if they had 100% of it. So, but that's one of the ways we've been trying to work on trying to turn those 1% tax sales into something that actually may have value for the investors.
Just to echo something that Jim mentioned about the ownership bid down, we know it sucks. It's not something we want. It's been in the Constitution since day one. It's based upon the old principle that most of the land was undeveloped. You had farmland. It could be 100 acres. You owe $500 taxes, it goes unpaid. The Constitution was directing the sheriff to take the least quantity of ownership and sell it to satisfy the bill, that's unpaid bill. That was the point of that. There are other states that used to do that. We're the only one still doing it, if you can believe that. So it's an old archaic system. It doesn't produce good results, and it definitely needs to be changed. That's why there's a committee formed by the Law Institute that Jim and I are both a part of that we can are working to get that law changed. Laws don't get changed like that in the Constitution very quickly. It goes through committees of law institutes and then full bodies of law institutes and then legislative committees, and then eventually everyone who's a citizen here in Louisiana will get a chance to vote on it one day, and hopefully you'll all vote yes. But it satisfies a lot of, it cures a lot of the problems that the investment community experiences in tax titles in Louisiana. It also cures a gross, I would say, inequity and inefficiency of the bidding process at the tax sale. Right now, it's how fast can you, if it's an online auction, how fast can you press the 1% button on your keyboard, hit enter? How fast is your internet speed? Because you can't get less than 1%. So as soon as you go to 1%, auction's closed. So you may have experienced that if you're a buyer at the online Louisiana tax sale and you wanted that property, even if you were willing to bid down to 1%, and someone else beat you to it, you didn't have an opportunity for it because their internet speed maybe had a millisecond faster transmission than yours. At a premium bid up auction, it's infinite. It's how much do you want to pay? So it's a true competitive bid nature, even online, and the sky's the limit. So there's a point where hopefully you will determine that it's not worth it for you to go any higher, and that would be a true auction. So that's what we're hoping to get to.
And the same works if they decided to go with the bid down on the percentage. If you're going to get a 2% return, whether it's for the first year or for the entire thing, most people aren't going to want to bid that. So as the earlier speaker was saying, at some point it's going to flatten out into some stable area where most people realize they can make a good enough profit without doing that. I'd like to open it up to questions. Good.
There you go. Nice segue, by the way.
Yeah. Do y'all have any evidence or any information on what the effective yields in other states are for, interest rate bid down or premium bid up?
I haven't done that research.
You talk about from an investor standpoint about the differences or no?
I think we're getting basically the same returns as they would with Louisiana.
It's just feedback I've heard from the investment community that does participate in more nationwide investments. That Louisiana right now, the current system falls somewhere in the upper half of attractiveness for investors. They're certainly better than more than half, but not the best. And usually the number one reason why it's not in the top is because of the ownership bid down component.
I also think Louisiana has a longer redemption period than a lot of other states.
True.
A lot of them are, I think, as short as 1 year, some shorter. I'm not sure about that.
Texas,
but,
I think, is
1 year and 2
months.
year. That's another thing we've talked about at the tax sale committee. But getting legislators to take that away just seems highly unlikely. So.
New Orleans, we passed a constitutional amendment a few years ago that allowed blighted properties, you've already heard us talk about that today, in Orleans Parish, if it's adjudicated as blighted by the code enforcement department prior to the tax sale, not afterwards, it shortened the redemption period from 3 years to 18 months. That got passed last year to be statewide. No longer just Orleans Parish. But it's a common misconception that it's applicable if the blight judgment occurs after the tax sale. That is not true. It's only pre-existing, because nobody controlled it. You can't say it fell into blight afterwards, and then all of a sudden, that something was 3 years, all of a sudden its redemption period ends today. You just can't do that.
So you can't buy a property and then go report it to code enforcement, get a blight judgment, and then say it's in 18 months. And I just had a case where that was finally decided in the Fourth Circuit, just within the last year, I think it was, year and a half, can't remember, but.
But that's researchable. A mortgage, in the mortgage records is going to show blight judgments. And so if you're interested in pursuing the 18-month redemption period, of course, they're going to be blighted properties, but you can search for that in the mortgage records and hone in your bidding on just those properties, or target them at least.
But I would caution that there are problems with the code enforcement proceedings in New Orleans. So if that blight judgment is not valid, then arguably they would have an argument for lack of due process notice relative to the blight judgment. And so if that falls, you'd still get a 3-year redemption period if the tax sale notice was the same. So.
It seems to be like if you monkey with the, what you bid on, where you end up with a lower interest rate, no matter whether you do it as a premium or you do it as a deductible interest rate. And you don't also at the same time reduce the redemption period. The unintended consequences are going to be that you have a chilling effect on people like me that are looking for a certain target yield and are not going to be investing in these things, which would lead to ammunition of all the good stuff that you put in your career.
That's a good point, and that's been discussed. And we're working on some ideas for a solution to that, to balance the scale, so that the bidding structure is more fair, but we don't want to provide a disincentive for the investment community to spend their money here. And at some point, you would do that. I know a lot of big companies have pulled out of Louisiana because they got just fed up with the partial ownership bidding. But one way we've discussed is mitigating that issue is to allow the interest rate to be fully accumulated on the day one of the time of the year. So instead of it becoming 5% plus 1% on day one in the first month, it would be 17% on day one of year one. It's a yearly interest rate. That's not changing, but it's fully earned on day one. Which means that if you think about it, if right now in the current system, if the first month's redemption rate is 6%, if you have bid down the rate or if you've bid up, and now you might be losing money in a first month redemption. And the likelihood of that happening if the rate is 17%, very unlikely. 6%, pretty likely.
On the other hand, you now give the tax debtor motivation to wait till the end of the first year before they redeem. So, and earlier they're talking about strategies. I have one guy I know his strategy is to buy, gets the 5% and the 1%. He sends his notices out immediately, hustles, tries to get the redemptions, and he says, okay, so I've got 6% or 7%. I reinvest it in the next tax sale. I get another 7%. I do that 3 times. I'm now up 24, 25, 26% annual return on the same money. Plus, you've got more money to invest. So other people's strategies are different. One strategy is, and which is the one I generally use, is sort of a little bit of both. I want a bunch of my money to be given me that pretty certain 12% interest plus the 5% penalty. And you also get the 5% penalty on your later year's tax payment. So that's a good way to leverage it. You buy a $10,000 property, then you pay the next year's taxes, that's 20, then 30, and you get the 5% penalty. What I also do is I'll take a little bit of a flyer. I'll take a property that's like, I don't know, but I may be able to get title to this. And I've had some success. I had a property near the new VA hospital that I bought, and it was a massive headache. It had a $235,000 mortgage on it, which I managed to buy out for $1,000. It was assessed, or no, I think it was 165. It was assessed at $235,000 when it was worth about 20 to 30. I had to go to the tax commission to get them to reduce the tax rate. The owner was happy to give me a quitclaim deed, but I didn't want to. I didn't want it yet until I'd solved all those other problems. I ended up making money on it, but if I wasn't representing myself and knew the ins and outs and going to the tax commission, I'm not sure I would have recommended it. But there's sort of this balance. Take the easy money on the redemptions, 90%, 85%, whatever are going to get redeemed. Then take a chance on a few. I've got a client right now who bought a property. I think he's in it like 6,000 or something. Redemption period expired. They contacted us. It was a succession. They said, we'll pay you 8. We said that's not enough, but I'd be willing to offer you 5 to come, to save the cost of quieting title. They said, okay. We think the property's worth between 80 and 100 as is. So that's a pretty penny to make on an investment. There's another tax sale, I think, he's in at about 30, including he'll have to redeem a later tax sale that can still be redeemed. So, you take a couple of those and, you can make some big chunks of money, but you also want the security of having a steady return. But everybody has their own standards and how they want to invest and the risks they want to take. Yep.
On the, when you've been down in the set like that, seems like to me the banks, the people that have the free money have a very unfair advantage over people that borrow money or whatever, the little guys like us.
You're talking about in the bid down of ownership percent?
Percentage interest or the ownership interest? The interest rate or the ownership?
Where you bid down the interest rate.
Yeah.
Yeah, my preference is of the options, you got to pick one option, right? If you want to play ball, you got to pick a way to do it. Of your choices, those are the three big choices. To me, the bid down ownership is not really a good choice. So you're really down to two choices. You're going to bid down the penalty, bid down the interest rate, or you're going to bid up the price, or bid up a premium. Sorry, the price has to stay fixed because you can't increase someone's tax.
The overbid's not that big a deal, you can live with that. But
Right.
if you bid that interest rates down, it can get
Yeah, but the other good thing about bidding up the premium idea is that it gives the government more options of what to do. Because like Jim said, we haven't even decided if we do pass that law, the legislature would have to come out with some statutes of what to do with that extra money.
That's
You know?
Because like in some states it just goes to the county, if it's never bid, it goes to the county, it's extra revenue for there.
Yeah, maybe that's a good thing. I'm sure you might have some others on the other side of the aisle say maybe we should give some back to the homeowner. Maybe the.
On the homeowner that it had a tax to start with.
Hey, I didn't say I was suggesting it. I'm just saying some.
Well,
have suggested
one of
it.
the
But-
reasons, and some of the representatives and the people in some of the smaller parishes, the idea was that you would sell the least quantity of property. If I could still end up with 99% of my property after a tax sale, and now I'm going to lose 100% of it, well, maybe I at least ought to get that $500 on the premium if I do redeem. So, those are things. There's a balancing. We have a populist history in Louisiana, and so there's one of the balances. And some of the rural parishes don't want to get rid of the 1%, or not the 1%, but at least I can say we're going to sell 10 acres out of my 40 acres,
Right.
and do that. Because we had talked about that, and one of the guys says that's never going to fly in whichever parish it was. So it's like, oh, I guess, because we also got to get the votes from the legislature to pass these things. So it's going to be a compromise. Right now, the big players like Mooring Tax Asset Group, have pretty much left Louisiana. Some of their employees and other people have come in and started little things to do it, but a lot of those don't want to do it. There was also a discussion earlier, I think the guy from Capital One, how the banks don't want to invest because they consider it a deed, not a lien, and there's different regulatory requirements to invest in people who want to, leverage and buy money, borrow money to buy tax sales. So, there is no perfect solution. We're trying to get something that will both be an improvement and be able to get passed. It's the old story about watching laws get made and watching sausage get made. It's
Or watching
not
grass
always
grow.
pretty, and watching grass grow.
Right. Open the floor to questions. Louisiana tax sale law, questions, quieting title.
What kind of impact does the road home have on
Road Home is everybody here familiar with the Road Home program, post Katrina? It's, well, Post-Katrina, there was a federal funding and state funding that produced funds for people to apply for that had damage, uninsured damage from Katrina, over and above their insurance coverage, or if they had no flood insurance, for example, if they were a homeowner or a small rental program. And so when they qualified for that amount of money and it was awarded to them, there was a covenant recorded in the mortgage records. Covenant's not a mortgage, it's not a conveyance. It's a obligation to do something in a certain way that affects that property. And the road home covenant requirement was that they had to stay in the home. If you got the money, you're gonna have to stay in the home. If you chose to take the money, now you could have chosen to sell the property back to the state and not take the money, all that kind of stuff. But if you chose to take the money, the covenant required you to stay in the home and rebuild it. And you had to stay there for 3 years. So part of the title issues that we deal with when we see road home covenants is to obviously looking at compliance as being an issue. That's hard to determine from reviewing the public records, and especially from a title examiner standpoint, where you're trying to say, well, I see the covenant, how do I possibly know if it was complied with? The road home has its own enforcement agency. They have their own department within themselves that is actually most recently, in the past couple of years, you may have heard of somebody getting a letter saying, you got this money, we have reason to believe that you didn't comply, you owe it back. They actually have they've been pulling their own little IRS playbook and trying to go back and get money from people. So in the tax title world, where we're trying to clear the title from everything, we are actually are providing notice to the State of Louisiana Office of Community Development, which houses the road home program, with due process notice of termination of rights. So if they have an issue with that property, this is their opportunity to come forward and cure it, and speak now or forever hold your peace, kind of a thing.
Is the refund obligation personal to the individual, or does it create
That's a really good question. Once it will become at best a personal obligation after I'm done with it.
Yes.
And with the road home, if the person loses their house foreclosure, how does that, where does the road home stay?
It would become irrelevant because they're going to get noticed. They're going to get noticed like everybody else, and if they have an issue, they have their constitutional right to come forward and state their claim. And if they choose not to do that, then they have given up their right to do so at a later time. All right. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it.